When you retire, you may get a chance to go to football heaven. This is football heaven.
Hello and welcome to The Mission. I'm your host, Jameer Howerton. And as always, we have a great show for you as the Pro Football Hall of Fame celebrates its 11th straight year of teaming up with Ford for the Ford Pro Football Hall of Fame fan vote. Once again, fans can join in and vote like a Hall of Fame selector by visiting profootballhof.com/fan vote. Fans will have the opportunity to vote as many times as they wish to predict the 5 modern era players that will be elected into the Pro Football Hall of Fame for the class of 2021. Participants will be eligible for many sweepstake prizes, including a grand prize trip for 2 to the 2021 Enshrinement Week powered by Johnson Control right here in Canton, Ohio. And check this out, guys. There have been more than 25 million votes that have been cast over the past decade. So join in and be a part of the fun. The special teams unit is an extremely important unit on a team, and it's oftentimes can change the course of a game like that. I mean, how many times have you been watching a game and you see it come down to a field goal, or it will come down to an onside kick, or there's a fake punt? And what I get upset about is that when you have these conversations with your friends, oftentimes, oh man, if it wasn't for that block punt, or if it wasn't for that field goal block, we could have won that game. No, you really couldn't have, because special teams is a third of the game. And these men get paid a lot of money. They study extremely hard, and they practice these plays over and over and over again. And to help us shed some light on a unit that sometimes kind of gets kicked to the curb is Brad Seeley. He's a 31-year vet in the game, special teams coordinator. He's seen a lot of kickers. He's coached a lot of punters. He's coached a lot of gunners, you name it. And he's going to be right here on The Mission to help us shed some light on this topic. Because right now, on the Pro Football Hall of Fame's website, you have 131 nominees to pick from. And out of those 130 nominees, there are 16 special teamers, 12 punters and kickers, and 4 special team returners. So who better to help us break it all down? No other than Coach Seeley. We'll be back with Coach Seeley right after this message. Shop online at the Pro Football Hall of Fame store, just like Hall of Famers, for exclusive Hall of Fame gear. Make your friends and family Hall of Famers. With all 32 teams in the store, there's something for everyone. Visit us online at profootballhof.com/store. Welcome back to The Mission, and as promised, we are now joined by a dear friend of mine. I like to say my special teams coordinator, 31-year vet, 3-time Super Bowl champion, special teams coordinator, Mr. Brad Seeley. Coach Seeley, welcome to The Mission.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Jameer. It's fun to be there and get the chance to talk about football and special teams.
Well, Coach, before we dive in and talk about X's and O's, first and foremost, I have to say congratulations on your retirement. You've been retired since June, and I just want to congratulate you and just see how you're doing first and foremost.
You know, I'm doing great. Enjoying every day. And, there's days, especially on Sundays, I miss football. Because you'd like to be out there scheming against somebody else and trying to win a game because, it's all about competition. But it's been fun. It's been fun to be I live down by the beach, so I do a lot at the ocean and just hanging out.
Coach, 31 years in the National Football League. It didn't start there. It started on the college ranks. But let's just take time to see and hear your thoughts on the coaches that you were just blessed to be around over the course of 31 years, and who were some of those coaches that you learned from, that you kind of stole some of their methods and you shared some of your methods of coaching?
Well, I'd have to really start back with a guy that wasn't a head coach ever, but really was a mentor for me, was a guy named Dante Scarnecchia. And Dante was a long offensive line coach at the Patriots. I worked for him as a graduate assistant when I was a college coach at SMU. And number one, he taught me a great work ethic, and he taught me really how to act around players and treat them like men and respect them. And then and when I got to pro football, he had been a long longtime special teams coach, and he was then the offensive line coach at the Colts on my first job. And man, I had to catch up. I had to catch up in a hurry because I'd been an offensive line coach in college. And so I coached the punt team and the field goal team, but the rest of it I knew nothing about. So every day I pretty much had to go to him to find out, try to keep one day ahead of those players. So, I got to start with him as a mentor for me. And then, some of the head coaches I worked for, going back, Ron Meyer, who recently passed away. He was the head coach at SMU. He gave me my first job at the Colts. And then a guy that I met coaching together with him was Pete Carroll. And Pete's still a good friend of mine and one of those guys that I really look up to because he never has a bad day. Every day is a good day for Pete. And I really admire that in a coach, And then you got to go to a guy like Bill Belichick, who I worked for a decade, in the sense that this guy knew all the facets, really knew special teams, really thought of its importance in a game, and always gave you good players to play with so you had a chance to be successful. And then I've worked for a lot of different guys that I've really enjoyed working for and learned a lot from. And I've been fortunate and blessed to be on some really good teams with a lot of really good players.
That's awesome. That's awesome. When we look back at college, and I was doing my homework, and I couldn't help but to notice that Oklahoma State offensive line coach, 2 running backs that are shrined right here in Canton, Ohio, Thurman Thomas and Barry Sanders. Early on in their career, did you see the greatness in them that you knew that they were going to go to the next level?
Well, that's interesting because with Thurman, I got to Oklahoma State when he was a true freshman, and he was actually our fullback on our punt team. And he was fantastic. He'd make about half the tackles, and so smart, such a smart football player, and a guy that you really enjoyed being around because you could talk football with him like a coach. And then when we got Barry Sanders, and I was fortunate enough to be with him all the way through his career, because I told him if he left early to go to the pros, I was leaving, because that was the only I couldn't keep up what we were doing because he was so fantastic. But with Barry, he was so different than Thurman as a runner. Thurman, he would do exactly what you asked him. He would do all the reads. And then when Barry became what he was, we'd throw the ball to him, and he's supposed to run to the right, and he'd go to the left, and it'd be like, what are you doing? And then about halfway through spring ball, you figure out, man, he just made 8 yards. Oh, he just made 20. He just made 30. So let's try to change our scheme just a little bit for him. Everybody hit him down the middle, and wherever he goes, he's going to go, and he's fantastic at it.
Wow, that's a lot to be said starting out as an offensive line coach, because I always remember of working around the team and guys up front would say, you know what, it's our responsibility. It starts up front. It starts with those men in the trenches. How did that translate, or you made that transition from O-line coach to special teams coordinator?
Well, when I first started in the NFL, we didn't have nearly as many coaches on our staffs. So when I came to the NFL, I was a tight end coach and the special teams coach. So you really had 2 jobs. And I think the thing that helped me in special teams by being an offensive line coach was really just about being precise and make sure that you didn't make it too complicated for the guys. And we tried to make it really black and white and not too gray. And I think I learned that from being an offensive line coach.
That's amazing. That's amazing, Coach. Well, let's jump into this conversation. I wanted to get the foundation and your history out there. I really just like to change the narrative, Coach. I'm tired of being in a barbershop and guys are just talking football, and you get that, man, if it wasn't for that block field goal, or if it wasn't for that block punt or that onside kick, we would have won the game. No, you wouldn't have, because it's special teams, and it's a third of the game. These men get paid to do that. Let's talk about the importance of special teams and really break that down, because I just really feel like it's a unit that you just look at offense and defense, and people really sometimes just it gets pushed to the side, if you will.
I think you're really right, spot on there, because again, I blame guys like yourself because it's the media, because it's really, if you talk about a team, what's the first thing you talk about? The quarterback.
Yes, sir.
And if you're going to talk about the defense, what's the first thing you talk about? Guys that sack the quarterback. So they never really get to the nuts and bolts of special teams because it's, it's not sexy. It doesn't sell as much, because it's the thing we always talk about in special teams is 80% of the field position that is changed in a football game is done in the kicking game. So that's a lot of field position. So, it's important. But what we have is we have one play to get it right. Either we get it right or we don't get it right. And we move on in the football game. Where in offense and defense, you could have a bad play. You see guys now, they throw a pick early in the game. Well, they come back. I was watching the game the other night, and they have 3 or 4 touchdown passes. Everybody forgets about it. Well, if you have one block punt in a game, nobody forgets about that. It doesn't matter if you punt 7 or 8 more times, you screwed up, and that was a big play in the game. So, I don't think it's not quite as sexy as O&D, but it's so very important to every football team.
In your special teams meeting room, what was like your theme? What was the one thing that you coached your guys up on a mental level to be?
Well, I think we're always looking for, and it's really the same as we're looking on O&D, but we're looking for smart, tough, dependable guys. Guys that were going to do their job. And really in the kicking game, what you would get sometimes, you might get some guys that they were kind of mad. They were mad that they didn't play on offense or defense. They didn't get to start. So they had to be in the kicking game. And we try to use that. Okay. We try to tell them that, hey, every kicking play is an offense and a defensive play at some point, So if you show enough there, especially young guys, if you show enough there in the kicking game, well, eventually somebody's going to notice that, and you'll get to play on offense, and you'll get to play on defense, and you'll get to be that big star,
Right. I always hear, guys would say, look, you got to be a little off to play this game of football, but you really got to be a tick off to play special teams. Guys like Blake Costanzo, who is known as the Tasmanian Devil, and your guy Brant Boyer, who is now the special teams coordinator for the New York Jets. Tough guys that really took special teams to heart.
Absolutely. You look at those kind of guys, I think back on a Larry Izzo. Now, Larry Izzo played for me for a long time in New England, and it was a great player for us and a great player for the Dolphins before that, but he understood his role. And I think that's a huge part of any kicking unit is everybody's got to understand, man, you're trying to help win the game by what you're doing right here. Because we'd always say the most important play is the one that's happening right now. And a lot of times that was our kicking play. So we had to do it right, and it had to be well executed, or it was going to affect our game in a bad way.
You look at all the rule changes. Do you think this has helped or hurt the special teams unit?
Well, I think, Jameer, number one, a lot of those rule changes were for safety. So I'm all in on that. Safety is paramount in our game. We just basically had too many high-speed collisions where guys would get head injuries, and that's one of those things over the years where we figured out that that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. But I think with the new rules, the sad thing is we don't get as many kicking plays. You see the kickoffs go out the back of the end zone. You see the punters now are good enough to kick it out of bounds. You don't see all those plays we used to see because the guys have gotten better. Kickers are stronger. Punters are better at directional punting. So they're their own worst enemy in the sense that the thing I felt like in the last couple of years is I couldn't affect the game as much as I used to be able to do in the kicking game. You couldn't change the game. You couldn't make the game better for your team because there wasn't as many opportunities. So, I think you got to temper that with safety of the game and, how much you get to do out there. So I think then each play becomes more important because you don't get that many of them.
Right. Taking a trip down memory lane, and let's dive in and talk about some of the toughest special teams units that you had to face over the course of your career.
Well, I think it goes back to a lot of coaches I coached against. A guy like Mike Westhoff, who some people remember. He was a longtime NFL coach, retired a couple years ago. He always, and I think every coach had like a strength. His strength was always in the return game. Whoever he had back there returning, you were always worried about him because he did such a good job of coaching those units. And then you'd play against a guy like Joe DeCamillis, a guy that coaches at Jacksonville now, and he's a fake guy. You got to always worry about some kind of deceptive, making you look bad because you weren't prepared for that. So I think everybody presents a different issue. Joe Marciano, another guy that recently retired, he was a guy that you're always worried about rushes because he did a great job of coaching up rushes. Frank Gans, longtime special teams coach, was a head coach at Kansas City years ago, did a great job on rushing the punter. So you always had to take special care against all those kind of guys.
When you look at your Super Bowls at UN, and you always used to hear the commentators talk about watch out after halftime, watch out for New England because they may come out and do a fake. And they may, talk about those fakes because I used to watch them in practice of how you guys would practice them. But was it one of those things that you knew you were going to go in and fake, or was it kind of like you called it like right there and then?
I think a lot of it was number one, you had to figure out if it was going to be successful against that team, what kind of fake you wanted to run, who the guys were that were going to run the fakes, and then it all had to come back to the head coach. He
Gotcha.
had to be confident enough that you executed in practice that you could execute it in the game, and then hopefully it would all come together and mesh and then work. And then obviously if you had a play like that was successful,
right,
it could be a real game changer.
Yeah. You talk about how guys, this was a way of special teams, was a way of guys getting on the team and making their way in. And then once they could become a star, they could become a starter. But who were some of the starters that you remember that actually played on special teams, thrived on special teams, and wanted to be a part of special teams?
Okay, that's a great question. I can think of guys that I had to play against. For instance, Dion Sanders. Okay. Now, nobody ever talks about him as a punt returner.
Right.
This guy was fantastic. We were playing him once when he was at the Cowboys and I was at the Panthers. We were playing him in a divisional game in the playoffs, and we got in a safety. So we had to kick off to him, and he was back there catching the punt for Ron Stark, a guy that's up for the Hall of Fame this year. And I remember that they ran a return to our right, and Dion, he just took it to the left, and it was just him and Stark. And Stark made the tackle. I have loved Ron Stark ever since that play because he made the tackle on one of the greatest, if not the greatest, punt returners in the history of the NFL, Then another guy that comes to mind is Mike Vrabel, head coach of the Tennessee Titans. We got Mike from the Pittsburgh Steelers in free agency at New England, and the reason we got him was he was a really good special teams player for the Steelers because he couldn't get on the field on their defense. Well, once we got him, we found out he was good enough to start for us at New England. Well, then, so we had to have a deal. So Mike and I had a deal on the kickoff team. As soon as he made a tackle, he got to come off. So he in the first one or two kickoffs every week, he'd run by me and go, "I made that tackle," and I'd say, "Okay, you're off." So he could go play defense. But he was a guy, especially those New England teams. We had a bunch of guys like Mike, Teddy Bruschi, guys that were starters for us that they cut their teeth on special teams, and they knew how important it was.
Right.
And they played for us even after they became defensive stars, just because they understood that they could help change the game.
Awesome. And you got to buy into that. You spoke about Dion Sanders and you spoke about the punter that tackled him. Talk about some of those tough guys, because that's the one thing that you always hear in the locker room. Man, if you break it and you go, you better not get taken down by the kicker or the punter.
Well, that brings up a great story about another guy that's up for the Hall of Fame, Josh Cribbs. Josh Cribbs is one of the all-time best returners in football, okay? Well, we were playing the Steelers. I can't remember if it was in 9 or 10 at Cleveland. And there was, I think, one game it was 2 times, and the other game we played him, it was 1 time. He got tackled by the punter, okay? So at that time, we had a rule. If you got tackled by the punter or the kicker, you had to bring donuts for the whole team, okay, for the next week. So, Josh, every time he get tackled, I go, Josh, the punter got you. Hey, he was recruited to be a linebacker. So, Josh always had an answer for us while that guy tackled him, But there was another guy that was a great cover guy and a great returner, And there's not many of those guys. They're usually a good cover guy or a good returner, where Josh was both. He was a guy he was a gunner on the punt team. He was the guy that led our team in tackles as the kickoff team, and then he'd go out there and he'd return kicks. He had 2 in one day against Kansas City for touchdowns. He was just fantastic. Another guy comes to mind that a lot of people have forgotten because he didn't have that long a career was a guy named Michael Bates. Now, Michael Bates was our returner and cover guy for us at the Carolina Panthers.
Okay.
And Michael Bates is a guy that he won the silver medal in the Olympics at the 200 meters. So this guy was faster than anybody on a football field. And he was also he was a guy that ran track that was a football player. He wasn't a track guy that played football. So he would lead us in tackles every year as the gunner, middle of the kickoff team, and then he would go out there and return kicks and be fantastic. And those kind of guys are really rare, that kind of toughness with that kind of athletic ability.
That's amazing. And it's so great to see, because I'm just taking away the theme that you're educating us on is buying into the system and really pay off. And just to hear how some of those great teams that you were part of, those Super Bowl teams that you were part of in New England, when you speak of Teddy Bruschi, those guys cut their teeth on special teams and they knew how important it was. Right now, Coach, on ProFootballHOF.com, we're hosting the Fan Vote. And it's sponsored by Ford, and we have 130 of modern era nominees. And this year we have 16 special teamers, 12 punters and kickers, and 4 special teams returners. And I sent you over that list. But when you look at that list of guys, who jumps out to you?
Well, obviously I'm biased because of having Josh Cribbs, but the other guy that really sticks out as a returner was Mel Grey.
Okay.
Mel Grey was another guy that was so fast, and you would really have to scheme up all your coverage units against this guy because of his speed. Because one guy, even with good leverage, he'd lose the leverage because he just wasn't fast enough. So a guy like Mel Grey he'd keep you up at night because you'd have to do a lot of different things for a guy like that could return the ball. And then who's the other guys on that list?
So, yes, in fact, let me read. Yes. So when we're looking at the 4 special teamers, the returners, you mentioned Josh Cribbs, you mentioned Mel Grey, Brian Mitchell, and Steve Tasker.
Okay. Well, Brian Mitchell, now he was another guy that when we were at the Jets together, we tried hard to recruit him in free agency to get him,
I remember that.
This was a guy that was an option quarterback in college. And he was a guy that they didn't really know what he would do in pro football. But when he got to the Eagles, they figured out he was a great returner. And the thing about Brian was he was so strong. He could physically break a lot of tackles, kind of like Josh, a bigger man that had all the athletic ability, but he could run through tackles too. And so a guy like that was, man, we tried hard to get him. We just couldn't get him.
Big shout out to our Pro Football Hall of Fame curation department led by Jason Aiken, and his efforts of putting together our set today here in the presentation center. As you can see, Steve Tasker's jersey and Josh Cribb's jersey. And then over here we have Hansen and Anderson's jersey, which leads me to naming off the punters and kickers coach. David Akers, Gary Anderson, Jason Elm, Jeff Fiegels, Jason Hansen, John Cachet, Sean, don't want to mess up his
Landetta,
Ryan Longwell, Nick Lowry, I remember years from being at the Jets, Reggie Robb, Ron Stark, and Matt Turk.
Yes,
Matt Turk, excuse me.
You're talking about a lot of good players. And I was fortunate enough to coach David Akers and John Casey and Ron Stark and Nick Lowry. Those guys were all fantastic players in their own right, and so it's hard for me to be, I guess, not biased in the sense that I got to work with these guys and saw their greatness every day, but now if you talk about a guy like Jason Hansen, you won't find a guy that was any better for a longer period of time than Jason Hansen. This guy was fantastic for years and years and years. I think he played 17 or 18 years in the league and was tremendous, So the thing that's sad is all those guys can't get in. It's like, okay, we've got a group now, but we can only take maybe one, at a time. And a lot of those guys have deserved to be in there and deserve to get in there sooner,
Right.
And so I'm just glad they're getting the recognition, because like I see Steve Tasker's jersey back there. Now, Steve Tasker, when I first started in the league, it was like, oh no, how are we going to handle Steve Tasker? Because he would line up any place on the kickoff team and do anything. He would run to the middle, it was so hard. And then you had to figure out a different way to block him as a punt rusher because he was so good. One guy couldn't block him. So you always tried to figure out a way to double him if possible, and he was just so tremendous. He was a guy that I think he was one of the first guys to take special teams to a different level, He was and he was so smart. I know we were playing him one Sunday, and what he'd do is he'd be, as a gunner, he'd be running down the field, and the guy's blocking me, go, oh, hey, it's over. And they'd stop, and he'd keep going. It'd be like, you guys, you got to figure it out. Just listen for the whistle. Don't go by what Steve says, So all those guys are, in my opinion, all have attributes that should be in the Hall of Fame. Now I know they're not all going to get in,
right?
But I'm glad that people are recognizing them for what they did in the NFL.
Two guys who aren't on this list that I would be remiss to mention. One, Adam Vinatieri, who you coached, but then also two, Phil Dawson.
Absolutely.
I can't wait to see their names pop up as time goes on. But what made Adam so special?
I think the thing about Adam was of all the kickers I've coached, and I was fortunate to coach a lot of really good ones, he was probably the worst practice kicker that we ever had. He'd miss a bunch of kicks in practice and be like, geez, come on, but when he'd get to the games, it was so mental for him, and he was such a competitor. He wasn't going to miss in those games, and I really think that that's what made him different than a lot of guys out there, is just his mental toughness and his attitude that if he missed one, he'd get literally so mad, and it would be like, I'm not missing again. And he wouldn't miss for the next 10 kicks. It was just a mindset with the guy, and so I think that's what really made him really special in that regard.
And speaking along those lines, Phil Dawson, he came back 2-3 years ago, and I believe it was 2 years ago that he actually became and retired as a Brown. And he is just one of those guys that's a beloved Brown. I mean, he's just like your favorite Cleveland Brown for me.
Absolutely. Because even all the years where Cleveland struggled as a team,
Special team.
this guy had success. He was successful at his job, and he was such a pro. We were fortunate to get him. I coached him in Cleveland, and then we also had him at the 49ers.
That's right.
And, he was a guy that you just appreciated the way he approached practice, the meetings. Man, he was all business. And he wasn't a guy that, once we got done talking about kicking game, he shut it down. He was listening to what the defense was doing. He was listening to the offense. He was into the game. And the sad thing for Phil, in my opinion, is he was on so many teams that didn't have success, never really got the notoriety he should have gotten.
Right. He was also too, and I'm quite for sure all the other punters and kickers, but I used to call him Baby Al Roker. That guy, I mean, he had flags put up at the time was First Energy Stadium now, but Cleveland Browns Stadium. I mean, he was I remember times where Chris Powell, who's the head grounds crew guy, Phil would be in his area, in his office, if you will, in the bowels of the stadium, watching the weather reports.
He was amazing.
Minute up to the minute of the game, he was watching the weather reports.
Absolutely, because wherever I've been, I'm a weather guy. I mean, I can tell you today, the wind right now is about 9 miles an hour outside my house. Okay, I'm always checking it. I still check it, But when I got with Phil, it was like, where'd you get your weather report? Well, I got mine right at the stadium. I get it right off the stadium. And it's like, oh my gosh. And here was a guy, he would go to the games with the ball boys. He'd go to the game with the trainers, and he'd be out on that field about 4 hours before the game, figuring out what the weather was, how the field was. He was unbelievable in his preparation for every opportunity he had to kick.
Yes, he was. Well, Coach, let's have some fun now. I need everybody now to break out their pen and pad, because not only have we been going to school, but right now we're about to go to college. We're about to get a college course. We like to do this with all of our guests, Coach, and get your top 5. And with you, I want to get your top 5 challenging stadiums where your kickers and punters had to kick.
Oh, wow. What a great question. Jameer, I'd have to start in the Northeast. The Northeast is the hardest place to kick in the NFL. So you got to go at Buffalo. Buffalo was really bad. Now, what they've done at a lot of these stadiums, they've helped because they put up more club seating. So they've knocked some of the wind out of it, because if you started with number 1, it'd be Old Foxborough Stadium.
Okay. Foxborough, okay.
Because it was a high school field. It didn't have any end zones, and the wind would just go straight through there.
Wow.
We were playing a game, and Ron Stark, who's up for the Hall of Fame, was our punter, and he went out there to punt, and he hit a ball right to the down marker, about 2 yards on our sideline. And nobody was at the game because they were bad. We were bad at the Colts, but it was like an explosion. And I go, Ron, what happened? He goes, I was lucky I got that ball on my foot, So that place was horrible. And then when they had a grass field, it was even worse because it would be muddy, sloppy.
Right.
We played there one Sunday after a storm, and they had to use a blowtorch to get the tarp off because they'd left the sprinkler on. And the tarp just blew up into the light stanchions. So it was hanging up there, and it was like, oh my gosh, this has got to be the worst place in America. So that would have to be number 1.
So we got Foxborough number 1, Buffalo number 2. Okay.
Buffalo number 2. Then I got to go with Cleveland.
Okay.
Now Cleveland's gotten better because they've made a new stadium, but the old Brown Stadium, oh my gosh, the field was horrible. Everything
and the locker room was horrible too. The visiting locker rooms.
Oh,
I know I'm sorry. I know we're going down a rabbit hole, but there were nails for where you would hang your clothes up.
If you brought an extra guy, you just brought an extra nail. That's how that worked. That was a bad place. But It's gotten better because
Yes.
they got a new stadium, but it's still tough because of
Okay.
the weather and the grass field. And then I'd have to go to Pittsburgh.
Wow.
Because of the new stadium there, the wind off that river, it's really hard to kick it into that side,
Gotcha.
especially later in the year. And the same thing with their field. Their field gets really chewed up and it's not very well kept up, so that's a bad place. And then a place that it really wasn't the field conditions, but you got to go all the way out to Seattle. When they had the Kingdome, it was so noisy, you'd always have a headache. Nobody could hear. You couldn't communicate on the sideline. And even now with the 12th man in that stadium,
Yeah.
it's still the loudest stadium in the NFL. And it's just hard to communicate with anybody on your sideline. And you're always taking aspirin after the game because it's a headache.
That's awesome. Foxborough, Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and rounded out with Seattle. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And we got one more list for you now. One more list for you. You mentioned him earlier, but I don't know if he's going to be on this list. But the top 5 all-time game-changing kick returners, punt returners, and why?
Okay.
You necessarily schemed not to make sure that these guys had the ball in their hand.
Okay.
Because you knew they were deadly.
You got to go with Dion Sanders. Dion Sanders was fantastic, Again, I'm tooting my own guy's horn, but Michael Bates is a kickoff returner. Nobody ever wanted to kick to him. We were playing Atlanta one day, and the coach of the other team said they were just calling him Braveheart because it was always 1 against 11, and the one guy would win. So
Michael Braveheart Bates.
He was fantastic. He was fantastic kickoff returner. Then you got to go with a recent guy would be Jesse Hester.
Okay.
He from Chicago. He was fantastic, fast. He's really good. He was really good. He was a guy that you did not want to kick the ball to, tried to keep it away from him. Whenever he got it in his hands, it would be like, hold your breath. This guy's going to be a problem, Let's see, Hester and Michael and Dion. The guy we talked about earlier down at New Orleans, Mel Grey.
Mel Grey.
He was another guy that scared the heck out of you. You just did. It was like, oh, geez, we got to play New Orleans. And this guy was on the, is he hurt? Is there something wrong with him? Maybe he won't be out there, And so that was another guy that scared the heck out of you. And then you got to go a recent guy that always gave us problems, and you were happy when he wasn't back there returning anymore, is Tyreek Hill.
Okay.
Tyreek Hill, just because of his speed.
Wow.
He was so fast. He can change the game. He could change the game so easily, So those are 5 guys that would keep you up at night.
That's amazing, Coach. That's amazing. And, Coach, before we let you go, just moving forward, what would you like to see from the Hall of Fame Selectors Committee as they're making selections into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in the regards of special teams?
Well, I think it's like anything else. It's all about education. Understand, number one, how important that phase of the game is, like you talked about. It's a third of the game. And then let's give some of those guys their due, Steve Tasker. Steve Tasker should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago, because of what he did on a football field was different. It was something that it doesn't come around every day. So there's a guy deservedly needs to be in the Hall of Fame, but he doesn't get enough votes because people, I don't know if they just don't give it enough credit for what he did or whatever it was. But to me, it's all about education. Here's a guy that changed the game. Somebody in that room, and I know how they do it, somebody's got to stand up on a table for the guy and say, hey, listen, here's what this guy did. And maybe the thing that's tough for a lot of those special teams guys, it's hard to quantitate. They don't have a number well, this guy rushed for this many yards. Well, that's sixth all time. He should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Well, some of those special teams guys, because of their talent, maybe Steve Tasker never led the Buffalo Bills in tackles, but that was because we had three guys on it. You know, we would play against a guy like that, and the number one thing was he wasn't going to be on the stat sheet. And if he's not on the stat sheet, man, we had a heck of a day. You know, so those kind of guys, sometimes the numbers don't equate to what they did. And you'd like for those media guys in there that are voting to have some knowledge of that, you know?
Wow. Well, Coach, I want to thank you so much for you taking time out to join us right here on The Mission during your time off. Enjoy your retirement. Anytime you want to come back and just talk with us, you are so welcome right here on The Mission. Ladies and gentlemen, Brad Seeley.
Thanks, Jameer. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your time.